Gabriel has been in a relationship with Linda for 7 months, but it's not a relationship between equals. It's a dynamic where Gabriel has positioned himself as spiritual teacher, and Linda has been cast as student or disciple. At dinner tonight, Linda mentions a decision she's struggling with at work. A healthy partner might discuss the options with her, help her think it through. Gabriel doesn't discuss. He pronounces. He tells Linda what the universe is trying to tell her through this situation. He explains what her higher self already knows, but her ego is blocking. He describes what he claims to see clairvoyantly about her karmic patterns and soul lessons. Linda, who initially found Gabriel's spiritual confidence attractive, is starting to feel suffocated by his constant positioning of himself as the one who knows while she's perpetually the one who needs to awaken. When Linda tries to simply share her own thoughts about the decision, Gabriel interrupts with, "Yes, but that's just your ego talking. Let me show you what's really happening on the soul level." He has no capacity to engage with her as an equal because the Mana personality doesn't have peers. It has followers, students, people who need guidance. Linda is realizing she can never just be with Gabriel. She's always being taught, guided, analyzed through his inflated lens of supposed mystical insight. Later that evening, Linda tries to create ordinary intimacy. She wants to watch a movie together, just relax and connect. But Gabriel can't engage with anything ordinary because the Mana personality experiences everything as cosmically significant. He says the universe is calling him to meditate instead, that he's receiving important transmissions, that she should join him in spiritual practice rather than wasting energy on entertainment. Linda feels dismissed, but when she expresses this, Gabriel explains that her feeling dismissed is actually her ego resisting its own evolution. When they're physically intimate, Gabriel transforms it into a spiritual ritual. He's not making love with Linda as another person. He's channeling cosmic energies, performing what he calls sacred sexuality, talking throughout about kundalini and chakras and divine union. Linda feels like an object in Gabriel's spiritual theater, rather than a partner in mutual intimacy. The Mana personality cannot have peer relationships, because it's possessed by archetypal authority that places Gabriel above and beyond ordinary human connection. Linda tries to explain that sometimes she just wants normal companionship, regular conversation, simple togetherness without everything being cosmically significant. Gabriel hears this as Linda being trapped in mundane consciousness, unable to meet him at his elevated level. He offers to help her evolve, suggests practices that will raise her vibration, explains with patient condescension that she's experiencing resistance to awakening. He has no shadow to acknowledge his grandiosity, no ego to recognize he might be insufferable, no persona to function as a normal partner. Over the following weeks, Gabriel begins gathering a small group of people for what he calls spiritual teachings. These are colleagues and acquaintances who are interested in personal growth, who mistake his confidence for wisdom, who don't yet realize they're being drawn into a dynamic where Gabriel is positioning himself as guru. Linda watches this development with growing alarm. She's seeing the Mana inflation expand beyond their relationship into something that looks disturbingly like a cult in formation. Gabriel now holds weekly gatherings in his apartment, and watch how he orchestrates these events. He's arranged the furniture to create a subtle hierarchy with himself positioned above the others. He speaks in a particular tone of voice that conveys mystical authority. He makes pronouncements about cosmic truths, karmic patterns, spiritual laws. The people gathered around him are seeking meaning, guidance, connection. What they're getting is archetypal inflation projected onto them by a man possessed by the Mana personality. One attendee, a young woman named Amy, shares that she's struggling with anxiety. A trained therapist would recognize this as a mental health concern requiring professional support. Gabriel approaches it as a spiritual teacher whose authority comes not from training but from his inflated sense of possessing special power. He tells Amy her anxiety is actually her soul trying to break free from limiting beliefs. He prescribes spiritual practices. He suggests she's experiencing a dark night of the soul that will lead to awakening. He positions himself as the guide who can shepherd her through this transformation. Amy, vulnerable and seeking help, accepts this framework. She begins to see Gabriel as someone with special insight into her condition, someone who understands her on a deeper level than conventional psychology could access. She doesn't realize she's being pulled into a dynamic where Gabriel's Mana inflation is exploiting her vulnerability. Jung warned about this explicitly. The mana personality is dangerous precisely because it can magnetize others, draw them into its inflated archetypal field, create followers rather than peers. Gabriel starts to talk about how he's been chosen to bring new teachings into the world, how he's channeling wisdom from higher sources, how those who gather around him are part of a special spiritual mission. This is the mana personality in full expression. Not content with personal inflation, it begins to create a mythology where the possessed person is cast as prophet, teacher, enlightened master. The group members, lacking psychological education to recognize archetypal inflation, interpret Gabriel's confidence as genuine authority. Watch what happens when one member, Tom, questions something Gabriel says. Tom suggests that perhaps Gabriel's interpretation of a spiritual concept doesn't align with traditional teachings. Gabriel responds not with openness to discussion, but with the authority of the mana personality. He explains that traditional teachings are for those still trapped in conventional consciousness, that he's accessing direct revelation that supersedes tradition, that Tom's questioning reveals Tom's own spiritual immaturity. The group quickly learns that questioning Gabriel is framed as spiritual failure rather than healthy skepticism. Linda, watching these gatherings from the periphery, recognizes the danger. She tries to talk to Gabriel privately about what she's seeing. She suggests gently that maybe he's becoming too invested in being a teacher, that maybe he should consider the possibility that he's experiencing inflation rather than enlightenment. Gabriel's response is chilling. He looks at her with what he experiences as compassionate wisdom and says, "You're threatened by my growth. You want to keep me small because my expansion triggers your own fears." He has no capacity to consider that her concern might be legitimate, because the mana personality cannot tolerate any suggestion that it's not genuinely superior and special. Linda ends the relationship the following week. Gabriel interprets this as Linda's inability to handle his evolved consciousness, her fear of true spiritual intimacy, her soul's choice to remain in darkness rather than follow him into light. He shares this interpretation with his group, using Linda as an example of how loved ones often resist when someone begins genuine awakening. The group nods, absorbs this narrative, becomes more convinced of Gabriel's special status, and more wary of voices that might question him. 6 months later, Gabriel's group has grown to about 15 regular members. They've begun calling him teacher or master. They seek his guidance for major life decisions. They've adopted his spiritual practices and vocabulary. They've begun to isolate from friends and family who question their involvement with Gabriel. This is the natural progression of unchecked mana inflation. It creates not a spiritual community, but a cult of personality centered on the inflated individual. Gabriel now speaks openly about his special mission, his unique access to cosmic wisdom, his role as a bridge between higher dimensions and earthly consciousness. He's developed elaborate teachings that sound spiritual, but are actually projections of his own archetypal inflation. He speaks of being guided by ascended masters, of receiving downloads of universal knowledge, of being tasked with preparing humanity for an evolutionary leap. The mana personality has completely overtaken any remnant of ordinary human perspective. One member, Sarah, has begun giving Gabriel money. She believes she's supporting his spiritual work, investing in the mission he's been called to fulfill. She doesn't realize she's being exploited by someone whose mana inflation has removed all capacity for ethical boundaries or self-awareness. Gabriel accepts the money with the conviction that it's rightfully his, that those who recognize his special status naturally want to support the important work he's doing. Another member, David, has stopped seeing his family because Gabriel suggested they were energetically toxic and dragging down his vibration. David's family is actually concerned and loving, trying to understand why their son has become distant and strange. But Gabriel has framed any outside concern as persecution, any questioning voice as darkness trying to suppress the light. David trusts Gabriel's interpretation because Gabriel speaks with the absolute certainty of the mana personality, which cannot conceive of being wrong about anything spiritual. Gabriel's workplace has finally taken action. After multiple complaints about his behavior, after his refusal to focus on actual work in favor of offering unsolicited spiritual counsel to everyone, after his insistence on interpreting every business decision through mystical frameworks, he's been terminated. Gabriel receives this news as confirmation of his special status. The mainstream world cannot contain his evolved consciousness. Corporate structures are threatened by his truth. He's being pushed out precisely because he represents something they fear. He tells his group about the termination as though it's a spiritual victory rather than a practical consequence of his behavior. They receive this narrative eagerly, seeing it as evidence that Gabriel is too advanced for ordinary society, that he's being persecuted like prophets throughout history. No one in the group has the psychological sophistication to recognize that they're watching archetypal inflation in real time, that their teacher is not enlightened but possessed, that the mana personality is as pathological as any other form of psychological imbalance.